I went over to the MO file and pulled out the stack of cards behind the tab High Speed Climb. There must have been at least 100 cards, each one representing a UFO report in which the reported object made a high-speed climb. But this was the first time radar had tracked a UFO during a climb. During the early part of June, Project Blue Book took another jump up on the organizational chart. A year before, the UFO project had consisted of one officer. It had risen from the one-man operation to a project within a group, then to a group, and now it was a section. Neither Project Sign nor the old Project Grudge had been higher than the project within a group level. The chief of a group normally calls for a lieutenant colonel, and since I was just a captain, this caused some consternation in the ranks. There was some talk about putting Lieutenant Colonel Ray Taylor of Colonel Dunn's staff in charge. Colonel Taylor was very much interested in UFOs. He had handled some of the press contacts prior to turning this function over to the Pentagon and had gone along with me on briefings, so he knew something about the project. But in the end, Colonel Donald Bauer, who was my division chief, decided rank be damned, and I stayed on as chief of Project Blue Book. The location within the organization chart is always indicative of the importance placed on a project. In June 1952, the Air Force was taking the UFO problem seriously. One of the reasons was that there were a lot of good UFO reports coming in from Korea. Fighter pilots reported seeing silver-colored spheres or disks on several occasions, and radar in Japan, Okinawa, and in Korea had tracked unidentified targets. In June, our situation map, on which we kept a plot of all of our sightings, began to show an ever so slight trend toward reports beginning to bunch up on the East Coast. We discussed this buildup, but we couldn't seem to find any explainable reason for it, so we decided that we'd better pick eastern states. I had this buildup of reports in mind one Sunday night, June 15th to be exact, when the OD at ATIC called me at home and said that we were getting a lot of reports from Virginia. Each report by itself wasn't too good, the OD told me, but together they seemed to mean something. He suggested that I come out and take a look at them, so I did. Individually, they weren't too good, but when I lined them up chronologically and plotted them on a map, they took the form of a hot report. At 3:40 p.m., a woman in Unionville, Virginia had reported a very shiny object at high altitude. At 4:20 p.m., the operators of the CAA radio facility at Gordonsville, Virginia, had reported that they saw a round, shiny object. It was southeast of their station, or directly south of Unionville. At 4:25 p.m., the crew of an airliner northwest of Richmond, Virginia, reported a silver sphere at 11 o'clock high. At 4:43 p.m., a Marine pilot in a jet tried to intercept a round, shiny sphere south of Gordonsville. At 5:43 p.m., an Air Force T-33 jet tried to intercept a shiny sphere south of Gordonsville. He got above 35,000 feet, and the UFO was still far above him. At 7:35 p.m., many people in Blackstone, Virginia, about 80 miles south of Gordonsville, reported it. It was a round, shiny object with a golden glow, moving from north to south. By this time, radio commentators in central Virginia were giving a running account of the UFO's progress. At 7:59 p.m., the people in the CAA radio facility at Blackstone saw it. At 8 o'clock p.m., jets arrived from Langley Air Force Base to attempt to intercept it, but at 8:05 p.m., it disappeared. This was a good report because it was the first time we ever received a series of reports on the same object, and there was no doubt that all these people had reported the same object. Whatever it wasn't moving too fast, because it had traveled only about 90 miles in 4 hours and 25 minutes. I was about ready to give up until morning and go home when my wife called. The local Associated Press man had called our home, and she assumed that it was about this sighting. She had said that I was out, so he might not call the base. I decided that I'd better keep working, so I'd have the answer in time to keep the story out of the papers. A report like this could cause some excitement. The UFO obviously wasn't a planet because it was moving from north to south, and it was too slow to be an airplane. I called the Balloon Plotting Center at Lowry Air Force Base, where the tracks of the big skyhook balloons are plotted, but the only big balloons in the air were in the western United States, and they were all accounted for. It might have been a weather balloon. The wind charts showed that the high-altitude winds were blowing in different directions at different altitudes above 35,000 feet, so there was no one flow of air that could have brought a balloon in from a certain area. And I knew that the UFO had to be higher than 35,000 feet because the T-33 jet had been this high and the UFO was still above it. The only thing to do was to check with all of the weather stations in the area. I called Richmond, Roanoke, several places in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., and 4 or 5 other weather stations. But all of their balloons were accounted for, and none had been anywhere close to the central part of Virginia. A balloon can travel only so far, so there was no sense in checking stations too far away from where the people had seen the UFO, but I took a chance and called Norfolk, Charleston, West Virginia, Altoona, Pennsylvania, and other stations within a 150-mile radius of Gordonsville and Blackstone. Nothing. I still thought it might be a balloon, so I started to call more stations. At Pittsburgh, I hit a lead. Their radiosonde balloon had gone up to about 60,000 feet and evidently had sprung a slow leak because it had leveled off at that altitude. Normally, balloons go up till they burst at 80,000 or 90,000 feet. The weather forecaster at Pittsburgh said that their records showed they had lost contact with the balloon when it was about 60 miles southeast of their station. He said that the winds at 60,000 feet were constant, so it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out where the balloon went after they had lost it. Things must be dull in Pittsburgh at 2 a.m. on Monday mornings, because he offered to plot the course that the balloon probably took and call me back. In about 20 minutes, I got my call. It probably was their balloon, the forecaster said. Above 50,000 feet, there was a strong flow of air southeast from Pittsburgh, and this fed into a stronger southerly flow that was paralleling the Atlantic coast just east of the Appalachian Mountains. The balloon would have floated along in this flow of air like a log floating down a river. As close as he could estimate, he said, the balloon would arrive in the Gordonsville-Blackstone area in the late afternoon or early evening. This was just about the time the UFO had arrived. Probably a balloon was a good enough answer for me. The next morning at 8 o'clock a.m., Al Chop called crawling all over his desk wanting to know about a sighting in Virginia. The reports continued to come in. At Walnut Lake, Michigan, a group of people with binoculars watched a soft white light go back and forth across the western sky for nearly an hour. A UFO paced an Air Force B-25 for 30 minutes in California. Both of these happened on June 18th, and although we checked and rechecked them, they came out as unknowns. On June 19th, radar at Goose Air Force Base in Newfoundland picked up some odd targets. The targets came across the scope, suddenly enlarged, and then became smaller again. One unofficial comment was that the object was flat or disc-shaped, and that the radar target had gotten bigger because the disc had banked in flight to present a greater reflecting surface. ATIC's official comment was weather. Goose Air Force Base was famous for unusual reports. In early UFO history, someone had taken a very unusual colored photo of a split cloud. The photographer had seen a huge ball of fire streak down through the sky and pass through a high layer of stratus clouds. As the fireball passed through the cloud, it cut out a perfect swath. The conclusion was that the fireball was a meteor, but the case is still one of the most interesting in the file because of the photograph. Then, in early 1952, there was another good report from this area. It was an unknown. The incident started when the pilot of an Air Force C-54 transport radioed Goose Air Force Base and said that at 10:42 p.m. a large fireball had buzzed his airplane. It had come in from behind the C-54, and nobody had seen it until it was just off the left wing. The fireball was so big that the pilot said it looked as if it was only a few hundred feet away. The C-54 was 200 miles southwest, coming into Goose Air Force Base from Westover Air Force Base, Massachusetts, when the incident occurred. The base officer of the day, who was also a pilot, happened to be in the flight operations office at Goose when the message came in, and he overheard the report. He stepped outside, walked over to his command car, and told his driver about the radio message, so the driver got out and both of them looked toward the south. They searched the horizon for a few seconds, then suddenly they saw a light closing in from the southwest. Within a second, it was near the airfield. It had increased in size till it was as big as a golf ball at arm's length, and it looked like a big ball of fire. It was so low that both the OD and his driver dove under the command car because they were sure it was going to hit the airfield. When they turned and looked up, they saw the fireball make a 90-degree turn over the airfield and disappear into the northwest. The time was 10:47 p.m. The control tower operator saw the fireball too, but didn't agree with the OD and his driver on how low it was. They did think that it had made a 90-degree turn, and they didn't think that it was a meteor. In the years they'd been in towers, they'd seen hundreds of meteors, but they'd never seen anything like this, they reported. And reports continued to pour into Project Blue Book. It was now not uncommon to get 10 or 11 wires in one day. If the letters reporting UFO sightings were counted, the total would rise to 20 or 30 a day. The majority of the reports that came in by wire could be classified as being good. They were reports made by reliable people, and they were full of